Hey guys, welcome to the second part of this REG course, completely free CPA prep course brought to you by thedailycpa.com. Again, my name is Jeremias Ramos. I am a CPA, and today we're going to be discussing the Internal Revenue Code and regulations related to tax return preparers. So today's learning outcomes, we're going to recall who is a tax return preparer. We're going to recall situations that would result in a federal tax return preparer penalties. And lastly, apply potential federal tax return preparer penalties given a specific scenario. So let's just jump right in. So who is a tax return preparer? Tax return preparer is anyone who prepares for compensation, who employs one or more persons to prepare for compensation, prepares all or substantial portions of any return, claims a refund of tax under the Internal Revenue Code. So basically, it's pretty broad. If you're touching any or all parts of the tax return, even if you're signing the tax return, then you're probably a TRP, which is a tax return preparer. So the first thing you have to know is the difference between a signing and a non-signing TRP. So a signing TRP bears primary responsibility over the return. They're going to be the manager, the partner, the one whose name is actually on the return, and they're going to sign it even though they don't prepare the return, but they're responsible for the return. Then you have the non-signing TRP. This is going to be your typical staff accountant. Their name is not on the return, but they prepared a substantial portion of that return that they're still somewhat liable. So what is a substantial portion of the return? Well, as a general rule, if you fill out any portion of the return, it could be one form, but if that form yields $10,000 or more in deductions, then you're a TRP. However, there's a general exception. It reads like this: less than $400,000 and also less than 20% of the gross income as shown on the return or claim for a refund. Now, I know that's a lot. It probably give you a headache, but let's explain that in simple terms. So basically, the first step, if you fill out a form, and if you get a question on the CPA exam and says, John Doe filled out a form and it equated to $10,000 in deductions, then you say he's probably a TRP. But then you also have to look at what their total income is. So if their total income, you take 20% of that, then that's the threshold you have to look at. So for example, if someone has $10 million in a tax return and someone filled out a schedule that has $10,000 or more in deductions, then there's some leeway there. Because if you have, let's say, $12,000 in deductions, but their gross income is $10 million, that's probably not a substantial portion of the return. And as long as it's less than $400,000, then it's probably not substantial. So going off of that, of who is not a TRP, an agent of the IRS is not a TRP. An individual in the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. So for example, if you volunteer in the VITA program, you fill out tax returns for lower income individuals, people who are retired, that kind of programs, you're not considered a TRP. The responsibility for the return is on the taxpayer, not the actual person filling out the forms. An individual providing only typing, reproduction. So for example, an assistant, if you're just an assistant and you're putting postage on the return and sending it out, then you're not a TRP. These are just more and more. Actually put a link on the article, so if you want to go to thedailycpa.com, look at this article. It spells out all the ones, but don't worry too much about memorizing all of these. Just know the general concepts of who is a TRP and who isn't a TRP. So let's dive right into the TRP penalties. So there's really no easy way of doing this, because there's a couple of them. They're almost the same, but they have their nuances. So I'm just going to list them out. This is something that you might want to memorize. Definitely go onto the website, write them out, make flashcards. So I'm just going to run through 1 through 5 some of the major tax return preparer penalties. So number 1 is the understatement of taxpayer liability by tax return preparers. So essentially, if you filled out someone's tax return and you intentionally understated their income, let's say they had $100,000 in side hustle income and you said, we're not going to report it. It's essentially greater of $1,000 or 50% of the income derived by the tax return preparer. So, for example, if your fees for the tax return is $10,000, then it's the greater of $1,000 or half of that $10,000, just as $5,000. Second one is promoting abusive tax shelters. So again, this is generally equal to $1,000 for each organization or sale of an abusive plan. Just know that general $1,000 rule. If someone does something and there's a penalty associated with it, it's probably going to be $1,000. Third is penalties for aiding and abetting understatement of tax liability. Same thing, the penalty is $1,000, $10,000 if the conduct relates to the corporation's tax return. Fourth is disclosure or use of information by preparers of returns. This penalty is $250 for each unauthorized disclosure. The fifth one is fraudulent returns, statements, or other documentation. This fine is not more than $10,000 or $50,000 if it's from a corporation. So there's a bunch of these. I put links out describing each one in detail, but for the most part, if you have trouble memorizing this, just know for the most part it's going to be $1,000 penalty. So quick recap, who is a tax return preparer? You'll know when you see one. Most people who touch a tax return are considered a tax return preparer, unless you're an inconsequential person who, they put postage, they put it in the mail, or they put a couple numbers in the return. They're not tax return preparers. You'll know it when you see it on the exam. And the second one is, what are some tax return preparer penalties? Memorize it. If you can't, just remember it's going to be $1,000 per incident or per penalty associated with a return. And that's about it. Until next time, hopefully this was helpful. Definitely check out the links on the website. And until next time, I'll see you.